Today we're talking about this little book, Freedom by Sebastian Junger. And the reason I picked this book is the topic of freedom is such an interesting, multifaceted concept that many of us are drawn to in some capacity. There's some element of feeling like part of our happiness depends on a certain amount of the freedom in our lives, freedom to do things, freedom from certain things. And you'll often hear people say to one extent or another, I don't feel like I'm in control, or, I want to be able to go do this thing. I feel trapped by X, Y, and Z. And freedom has been this major theme, right, for all of human history. And this book was really interesting because what Junger does is he goes on a 400-mile walk. It's like a journey along railroad tracks where he's living basically as a hobo would. He's following these train tracks. He's with a few friends. They're carrying everything they need to survive on their backs, bringing pretty limited food and gear, getting water wherever they can. And so he's telling this story of them living this quintessentially very free lifestyle. And while he's telling the story of that journey, he's talking about what it means to be free as a person. And I love the way he encapsulated what freedom is and what it means to be free, and what that means for not just our own lives, but for humanity as a whole, really what it means for society in general, because he does a really great job of describing and painting the benefits and costs of obsessing over freedom. Another way you could think of freedom in some senses is like options, right? Optionality. A lot of people want to have more and more options in their lives, but the more things that you make options for yourself, in some ways, the less free you become. And that's a concept he talks about in the book as well. So I went into it expecting one thing. I expected it to be a little bit more on the personal freedom side, and it ended up being much more on the society level side, which I ended up really, really enjoying as well. And I will say that the writing in this book is just beautiful. It's phenomenal, and it really made me want to go read some of Junger's other books as well, so maybe they'll be on future episodes. Super quick interruption to just remind you that if you are loving this podcast, if you're enjoying it, if you're getting any value from it, please send it to a friend. That is the most helpful thing that you can do to help this show grow. If you have already sent it to a friend, then I would love it if you took a moment to leave me a review on Spotify, iTunes, anywhere that you get your podcasts, or if you're not watching the video version on YouTube, just search Nat's Notes, Nat Eliason on YouTube, subscribe. Those really, really help the show out as well. So again, thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing and reviewing, and let's get back to the episode. Let's just dive in. He said, "The poor have always walked and the desperate have always slept outside. We were neither, but we were still doing something that felt ancient and hard. Most Americans did not own a car until after World War II, and traveling often meant walking out your front door and not stopping. During the Great Depression, 1/4 of the labor force had no work, and there were so many Americans on the move that rural schoolhouses were often left unlocked, so travelers could find shelter for the night. Schools always had a well to draw water for the horses and benches for the children to sleep on. Families generally stayed in the schoolhouses, and lone men slept in people's barns, when they were lucky, or simply out in the woods. We walked around 400 miles, and most nights we were the only people in the world who knew where we were. There are many definitions of freedom, but surely that is one of them." He's going on this long walking journey to kind of reconnect with part of the human experience, because for most of human history, we had to walk pretty long durations each day, or we had to walk quite a ways if we wanted to get anywhere. We didn't have cars. You might not have had a horse, or you might have needed to put things in the cart being pulled by the horse and whatnot. And so we ended up walking quite a bit. And that's something that we've lost a little bit of connection to. So this was a combination of exploring kind of the history of freedom and developing his own relationship with this very real part of the human experience. And he goes on to talk a little bit about the people who tried to join him and his friends while they were walking. And this one man who was basically just hanging out by the railroad tracks said that, if they could wait half an hour, he would come join them. And Junger says that he wasn't joking and he didn't ask where we were going. He just wanted in or out. You had to wonder about a man who saw 4 men walking along railroad tracks in midwinter and thought they had more to offer than his life at that moment. He didn't need us in order to walk out his own front door, but lots of things that look like freedom when you're with other people are just a form of exile when you're alone, and vagrancy might be one of them. But the inside joke about freedom, he would have found out soon enough, is that you're always trading obedience to one thing for obedience to another. Touches on a similar theme that David Foster Wallace mentions in This Is Water, which is another wonderful little book, where he says that, if you don't choose what you worship, then it will be chosen for you, because everybody at the end of the day worships something, right? And if you're not choosing to worship a certain ideology or like a practice or something like that, then you might end up worshiping consumerism or the politics of the day or something that you didn't intend to elevate to that status. And Junger's kind of saying here, it feels that you're always being obedient to something, but a lot of people are not necessarily choosing what that is. They're just kind of thrust into it based on their circumstances. So it's tempting to say that, oh, well, if I just like run away with these guys and live on the railroad tracks, then I'll be free. But you might be free from your old problems, but new problems are going to present themselves. It's kind of a grass is always greener type thing, where we always think that somebody else's life, which doesn't have any of the problems we see in ours, must be better. But the reality is they just have a whole different set of problems that we can't imagine. Recent example of this, I have a friend who owns a really big, beautiful ranch outside Texas. They're on dozens of acres. It's so quiet. There's no city noise. You're surrounded by trees and wildlife. It's a really beautiful place. And every time I go there, I'm just kind of like overtaken by how calm and peaceful it feels. And I asked him, I said, does that go away? Right? Do you eventually just kind of feel a whole new set of stresses from living out here that you didn't have in the city that replace the stresses you had there? And he said, yeah, it goes away really quickly, right? So it's tempting to think like, oh, well, if I just go like move out of the countryside, all my problems will go away. But you will find new problems to fill them in. And he starts to give these kinds of examples a little bit later on, where he talks about more established civilizations like towns and cities versus nomadic tribes. He says, one of the first cities in the world, Uruk had a huge standing army and as many as 40,000 people within its great walls. To hunters and shepherds, farming must have seemed unheroic and dull. To farmers, hunting must have seemed like a gambit to avoid the hard work of tilling fields and digging irrigation ditches. Nomads tended to keep to marginal rocky land that could never support crops, and one can imagine Neolithic farmers looking out at the dead mountains around them and being thankful that they passed their lives in one place and didn't have to continually search for food. But you can also easily imagine, hunters and shepherds watching men plow fields in the hot sun and thinking that such a life was a kind of servitude, and that it was better to risk starving in the mountains than to eat well on the plains. So you have this interesting eternal rule of human psychology, right? That we will always look at somebody else's situation as potentially better simply because it does not have the problems that we are dealing with. And this goes, all the way back. He talks about the biblical story of Cain and Abel and how they kind of created this contrast. He says Cain is the firstborn son who had inherited all of his father's agricultural land, and Abel is a wanderer who tends his flocks in the wilderness, right? And if you know the rest of the story, it eventually leads to a conflict between the two. It actually created problems for civilizations throughout history because in order to function, they needed to keep all of their people, right? Like a city in especially a new area, right? Like the early settlers to America or the people who are going west, right? You needed all of your citizenry to stay and help maintain the town or the settlement. So he says that nomadic society was far more appealing to the settled world than vice versa, particularly among the poor and disenfranchised. Chinese officials dismissed the Mongols as thieves and barbarians, but in truth, they had a hard time keeping their own citizens from fleeing to the steppe. Some scholars, including Weatherford, believe that the Great Wall of China was built as much to keep their own people in as to keep the barbarians out. And this is apparently a big problem in early settlements, colonies in America too, where residents in Jamestown, wherever else, would occasionally flee to live with the American Indians because they saw their life as better and happier, and perhaps it was. And so you can almost imagine this branding of the American Indians as savages as almost a way to discourage your population from running off and joining them, right? It's almost like this little early psychological warfare that it sounds like Chinese officials were doing with the Mongols as well. And Junger goes on to talk about how as long as you're living in a society, even as a nomadic hobo like he was for this period, you still very deeply rely on that society. You really can't be free in almost any part of the world today, freedom in the strictest sense. He says, people love to believe they're free, which is hard to achieve in a society that has outsourced virtually all of the tasks needed for survival. Few people grow their own food or build their own homes, and no one, literally no one, refines their own gasoline, performs their own surgery, makes their own ball bearings, grinds their own eyeglass lenses, or manufactures their own electronics from scratch. Everyone, including people who vehemently oppose any form of federal government, depend on a sprawling supply chain that can only function with federal oversight, and most of them pay roughly 1/3 of their income in taxes for the right to participate in this system. But we kind of take that for granted today, right? We have this almost childlike sense of entitlement to the things that society provides for us. Junger says, for most of human history, freedom had to be at least suffered for, if not died for, and that raised its value to something almost sacred. You can imagine how different your perspective on life in America would be if you had to go fight in the military for 4 years in active conflicts. In modern democracies, an ethos of public sacrifice is rarely needed because freedom and survival are more or less guaranteed. That is a great blessing, but allows people to believe that any sacrifice at all, rationing water during a drought, for example, are forms of government tyranny. They are no more forms of tyranny than rationing water on a lifeboat. The idea that we can enjoy the benefits of society while owing nothing in return is literally infantile. Only children owe nothing. And that's a tough argument to hear because I think we all have at times felt this way, right? That maybe why should I have to do anything or sacrifice anything for the country? What has it done for me? But it's done a lot for us, right? I mean, we're here and getting to enjoy this incredible life because of this, at times dysfunctional yet still standing hodgepodge of services and actors and people who are maintaining that for us. And he makes a pretty compelling argument here about how there is a very real sense in which we do need to sacrifice a certain amount of our time, energy, whatnot, in order to maintain that. There's a trend that I feel like we're seeing more on TikTok and wherever else now of young people or Gen Zs, people in maybe their early mid-20s who seem utterly distraught about having to work for money in order to keep affording their life, right? It's this really crazy, almost hilarious form of entitlement. And it shows how deeply that sense of entitlement has become ingrained in some people, that they shouldn't have to do anything. They should just keep getting this wonderful, incredible life and not have to sacrifice anything for it. But as Junger says, that is literally infantile. We all have to give up a certain amount of our freedom, money, time, whatever, to keep maintaining this world that we live in. There's an interesting paradox with wealth and money, too. He says wealth is supposed to liberate us from the dangers of dependency, but it quickly becomes a dependency in its own right. The wealthier we are, the higher our standard of living, and the more, not less, we depend on society for our safety and comfort. Or you think that if you're richer, you'll be freer to do more things and to have more control over your time, but often it's the poorest or the most disenfranchised who are the most free, right? If you think about an indigenous tribe person who's living outside of modern society, they are not wealthy in any modern sense of the word, but they are also extremely free. Whereas somebody who's incredibly wealthy, but it's because they're the CEO of a company where they have to work at it 60 to 80 hours a week, and then they have to have this whole staff to help maintain their houses and these financial advisors and everything. They're incredibly unfree in what they do with their time. They're much less free than somebody who works at their company and makes a lot less than them because they have all this energy and resources that go into maintaining that lifestyle. So more money and resources do not necessarily increase your freedom along with them. But then another thing that actually really contributes to freedom is movement. And we got a hint of this when we were talking about nomads versus people living in agricultural society. He uses an example of the Apaches here in order to show how a small tribe of nomads can actually really outlast, outmaneuver, and even defeat a much larger force that's concentrated in a city or settlement. Junger says the cost of cornering and killing determined resistors in virtually any environment, city, desert, mountain, jungle, is so high that large-scale societies often give up. None of this would be possible without the singular human ability to move huge distances on foot. Other primates can't come close to matching human performance on the ground, and even horses, dogs, and wolves have trouble outrunning humans in steep terrain or hot weather. And he uses an example of there's a race called the Western States 100, where runners and horseback riders race 100 miles over the Sierra Nevada. And humans can actually compete with horses on this race because of the heat. And that's pretty incredible, right? Humans are truly one of the best long-distance moving animals in the world, aside from operating in very cold climates, right, where sled dogs can outpace us. But so humans have this incredible ability to move around, and that helps us stay nimble and outmaneuver much larger forces that might not be able to move the way a small tribe could. There's also an interesting element here with the difference between the genders in how we perform with running. Junger says almost all running distances have a gender performance gap of around 11%, which is much lower than it is for weight events. From bench press to javelin to the discus to the hammer throw, female athletes perform at roughly 50 to 70% of the level of male athletes. The discrepancy is due to the fact that starting in utero, men have much higher testosterone levels, makes them stronger upper bodies, whatnot. But when it comes to running, women can keep up almost as well with men, and there are a lot of ultra-endurance events where women hold world records or are very close to the same times as men. And that's really interesting because that's very different from most athletic events, but humans are very balanced on this running factor, in part probably because tribes might have to move 10, 20 miles a day, and everybody had to be able to keep up. The men might have to carry a little bit more gear, and that might be why they have slightly better performance in that capacity. But the fact that both men and women can run these very long distances together is really, really remarkable. It provides humans this incredible ability to, again, outmaneuver larger groups of humans. There's also this really incredible aspect of running where your body doesn't break down during running the way it does during a weightlifting event. You know, if you're lifting a very heavy weight over and over again, eventually your muscles hit the point where you just cannot lift it anymore, and you will physically fail. Whereas with running, you might have periods where you go for miles being very uncomfortable, right? Something in your body is hurting, your legs are cramping, you feel like you're running out of energy, but you can kind of just keep going. If you're mentally strong enough, you can push yourself through it and realize like, oh, okay, that just kind of went away after a while. If you're doing an ultra marathon, you might have 5, 6, 7 miles where you feel like you have to stop. But if you just keep your legs moving through it, it eventually goes away. He tells this story earlier on about how when they're following the train tracks, they would get into something he called the cadence. He says, cadence sometimes descends on the entire group at once and can produce a strange feeling of elation. You know you're in cadence when walking feels easier than not walking. You know you're in cadence when you stop talking or even thinking and just walk. You know you're in cadence when the rhythm of everyone's footsteps coalesces into a long, complex tattoo that evolves over hours and bears you along like the current of an invisible river you've been seeking your whole life. That's a really beautiful way to describe the flow state you can get into during endurance events. I've done a couple of marathons and a half Ironman, and during all of them, there would be very long periods, sometimes over an hour, of just not really remembering anything that happened because I was just in that trance state and just, one foot in front of the other, one arm in front of the other, right? You just go and you lose all sense of tiredness or fatigue. It's a very magical state to be in. But aside from our ability to move long distances together, another really remarkable thing about humans that contributes to our ability to be free is our willingness to risk death for people we are not related to. He says the willingness to risk death for non-kin is unique to humans and may serve to keep large groups from splitting into smaller ones that would have had an even harder time defending themselves. And he tells the story about a train that was on a collision course, and because of the collision, the last passenger car was most likely going to explode or get severely derailed and kill everyone. And the engineer ran through the whole train to get to the car to warn them and try to get everybody out. And he ended up dying in the process, but he saved a lot of lives. Okay. But Junger's pointing out that that's actually a very strange thing for someone to do. He wasn't related to anybody in the car. He actually sacrificed his life to save all of these people he probably didn't know and had no relation to. And that's very unusual if you think of us as just animals, right? There's something very different about the human psyche that we can care about people we're not related to this deeply. We're not purely focused on our own genetics. It's almost like we have a subtle bit of the hive mind that you might see in bees or ants, but that doesn't really present itself in other mammals. And this is part of why we can have these small groups that can achieve freedom from large groups, why we are willing to fight together and even sacrifice ourselves for the freedom and independence of other people who we aren't related to, but maybe share beliefs with. And one of those really interesting beliefs that somehow caught on, and we take, again, something we take for granted today, but is again very strange, is human rights. And it started actually with the military. He says, granting rights to the vanquished was a radical idea that did not establish itself in Western thought until the mid-17th century. If a group lost in a war or in a battle or a skirmish or something, they would often become like slaves or vassals, right? They would just be absorbed into the victor, and they would, probably have to kill all of the men and take the women and children. They might make the men slaves, right? There was this pretty brutal treatment of the losers in a conflict, but that eventually changed, right? Until the mid-17th century, when a Dutch scholar named Hugo Grotius began his attempt to regulate warfare by observing that men must not believe that nothing is allowable or that everything is. It could be said that the idea of personal freedom as a legal right to be extended by the powerful to the weak got its start with Grotius and his attempts to codify the laws of war. It's actually very strange that we have laws of war, right? Like not killing civilians. That didn't exist for most of human history, right? You just killed everyone, but now we've kind of mutually agreed upon this around the world that that's not okay, and if a country does it in the course of warfare, or what we would usually call terrorism, that is what elicits the strongest reaction from the rest of the world, because they have violated this kind of international agreement on what's acceptable and what isn't. And he goes on, and Junger says that Grotius based his ideas on something called natural law, which held that human beings, because they were created by God, had rights, such as liberty, that could not be taken away. And it's something I've talked about probably in some past episodes before, but there is this very powerful thing that religion gave the world, which was this idea of natural law. If we are all equal under God, so to speak, then you can't violate those natural rights of other humans, even if you were at war with one another. And so for everything that could be said about all of the harm and violence that's been caused by religion, we also have to consider all the violence that was not caused because of religion, right? Which doesn't show up in statistics. There's no way to know how many people didn't die because we had religion, but this idea that everybody has a right to live is not necessarily intuitive without some like broader mythology to base it on, which we have somehow all eventually agreed on. That's a very powerful thing, and it's again something that has allowed us to develop greater and greater freedom over time. Because if everybody has a certain right to life, then there's a limit to how much a government or a monarch can oppress its people. They can't violate those natural laws, those human rights. And so this care for others, this care for people in our society who we aren't related to just because we share certain beliefs, is extremely powerful, and it's led to the large-scale organization and the increasing amount of freedom we have from, degrees of tyranny and violence that most of us get to enjoy today. I hope you're enjoying this episode. I just want to take a moment to tell you about Readwise. If you haven't used Readwise, it is the absolute best app for anybody who loves reading. I use it to read all of the articles online. I think it has the best-in-class article reader. I also use it to save my highlights and notes from everything that I read. So if you're reading something on Kindle or iBooks, it will just automatically pull out any highlights that you take and save them for you and send them to any note-taking tool that you use. And if you read physical books, like I do, I'll just mark with little sticky tabs as I go, and then I can use my phone to take pictures of the page and automatically scan in the highlights. It is so helpful for getting the most out of every single book I read, making sure that I can find any quotations or ideas I really loved in the future. If you're a serious reader, you absolutely need this tool. You can go to readwise.io/nat to get a 2-month free trial. It's a month longer than they normally do, and it's a great way to help support the show. So again, just go to readwise.io/nat and check it out if you haven't already. And let's get back to the episode. And the care for others leads into the next sort of defining factor about humanity that has led to and created some of the freedom that we enjoy, which is how we can fight, like how we can physically resolve conflict and some of the differences between how we do it and other primates. So, one thing he calls out is that for one, strength amongst humans, it can actually be surprisingly egalitarian, right? Strength does not increase linearly with body weight. The world record for the deadlift in the 148-pound weight class is just shy of 700 pounds, whereas the world record for the 308-pound weight class is 939 pounds. Doubling the weight class does not double how much a man can deadlift. In other words, it only increases the amount by about 25%. So I know, obviously, for UFC or wrestling or whatnot, we have weight class, but if you picked two guys at random on the street and you were going to say that they were going to fight, the bigger one wouldn't necessarily win. Often the smaller one would win, right? Not just because of training, but just because of maneuverability, endurance, some of the factors that might decrease as somebody gets bigger. So like size isn't purely an advantage. And it's kind of like what he was saying earlier about society versus nomadic tribes. You might think that, they have fewer people, so they can't defeat the larger, more organized army, but we know so many examples from history of that just not being the case. And so that works on a collective level, and it also works on an individual level. Sometimes the smaller, more mobile person can defeat the larger, bigger, stronger one. This is where he talks a little bit more about how armies work too, where he says, the logistical demands of a modern mechanized army are so enormous that most of its resources go into simply sustaining itself. No more than 1/3 of its soldiers are directly engaged in combat, and usually far less. Insurgents, on the other hand, are almost all engaged in combat, often including senior commanders, and they never have to win. They just have to keep not losing. And so the way that smaller groups and smaller individuals can fight actually can give them a surprisingly large advantage over larger groups. And so keeping on this theme of how these aspects of humanity have contributed to many of the freedoms that we enjoy today, this ability for small groups to organize and defeat large groups is a really big part of them, because you can imagine that if it was a pure numbers game, then whichever country was the largest or whichever idea had the most followers would just automatically win. But we know so many cases of a smaller group overthrowing a larger one. Or you can imagine the American Revolution, right? Much smaller numbers, much less powerful force, but they just had to keep not losing, and they could keep outrunning the British army. And it eventually paid off. You could think about America attempting to intervene in the Middle East, right? Obviously, the fighters there did not have the financial resources or the organization that the United States did, but despite the smaller numbers and limited resources, they were significantly more maneuverable and could, operate and react much quicker. And they didn't have all of these heavier aspects of being a large organized force weighing them down. So Junger says that however it's defined, freedom is due in part to the fact that powerful nations do not always win wars, and powerful men do not always win fights. In fact, as often as not, they lose. We have the compassion for others. We have running, right? Our ability to be mobile. We have fighting for smaller forces and individuals to defeat larger ones. And then the last big thing that humanity has that allows us to maintain more freedom is our ability to think and our ability to plan. And one of the things that we think about is how a society should be organized, how fair it should be. We don't purely rely on biological cues for who should be in control the way other animals might. We actually think and debate about the balance of power in societies. Junger says that the central problem for human freedom is that groups that are well organized enough to defend themselves against others are also well organized enough to oppress their own. Power is so readily abused that one could almost say its concentration is antithetical to freedom. Democracy, both its modern form and in its original indigenous form, is an attempt to balance the two. The Iroquois Great Law of Peace, for example, was established generations before whites arrived in North America and served as a philosophical starting point for the U.S. Constitution. I actually didn't know that before reading this book. In both Western and Native traditions, a warrior culture was fostered that could defend the tribe or nation, but was under the direct control of civilians. We often use this term servant leader in the U.S. and in democracy, right? Theoretically, the politicians should work for the people. They don't control the people. Civilians had to be willing to give up leadership when they were overruled by a majority because they presumably valued having no power in a fair system more than they valued having all the power in an unfair one. There's a term for this idea. I think it's called the veil of ignorance. I believe it's John Rawls. Basically, the way to imagine thinking about the ideal form of government that you would want is to imagine that you have no idea where you will land in that society. So you have this veil of ignorance about what part of society you will be in. You might be the most powerful person, you might be the poorest person. And so considering you don't know where you will land in society, what type of structure would you want that society to have? And he was arguing that you would probably land on some form of a meritocratic democracy like we have in the United States today. Maybe you would disagree. Maybe you would say that, no, I actually want a very autocratic communist dictatorship type situation. If you think that, you probably haven't read many history books, but you could argue that. But it's a good thought exercise, right, to say that, okay, if I don't know where I'm going to be in society, what kind of government do I want? And it does seem that some sort of democratic balance of power, servant leadership is among the best you could hope for, right? I guess philosopher king would be truly ideal, but again, you don't know who the king is, so it's a risky gambit. But the thing that often works against it is resources, right? He says that hunter-gatherers are generally spared opportunistic leadership because the gap between rich and poor is so narrow, which is not surprising in economies that don't use currency or stockpile food. So the more people can stockpile resources and hoard resources for themselves, the more unequal that society will become. There's this other term, I think it's called like the curse of resources or the curse of surplus, where countries who are very rich in natural resources often end up being the most corrupt unless a strong democracy is established before those resources are discovered or exploited. This is why some of the countries that have the greatest oil reserves are the most autocratic, because there's so much profit in controlling the whole country that they can sustain themselves despite a very unequal form of government, right? Whereas countries that are lacking in those natural resources can't be fully autocratic because there's no great source of wealth for them to control. And then the last thing he talks about on that topic is this idea of the Gini coefficient. So a Gini coefficient is a way to measure economic inequality in a country. It says the distribution of income in a society is called the Gini coefficient, named after an Italian sociologist named Corrado Gini, who published a paper on the topic in 1912. A society where one person earns all the money and everyone else earns none has a Gini coefficient of 1. In a society where everyone earns the same amount has a coefficient of 0. Neither is desirable. Moderate differences in income motivate people because they have a reasonable chance of bettering their circumstances, and extreme differences discourage people because their efforts look futile. A study of 21 small-scale societies around the world found that hunter-gatherers like the Hadza, who presumably represent the most efficient possible system for survival in a hostile environment, have Gini coefficients as low as 0.25. In other words, they are far closer to absolute income equality than to absolute monopoly. He goes on to say that the United States has one of the highest Gini coefficients of the developed world, 0.42, which puts it roughly the level of ancient Rome. Before taxes, the American Gini coefficient is even higher, about 0.6, which is on par with deeply corrupt countries like Haiti, Namibia, and Botswana. He says that it's tempting to imagine that economic injustice destabilizes society to the point where they collapse and have to reform themselves, but the opposite appears to be true. Countries with large income disparities, such as the United States, are among the most powerful and wealthy countries in the world, perhaps because they can protect themselves with robust economies and huge militaries. They're just not very free. Even societies with income disparities that are truly off the chart, medieval Europe had a Gini coefficient of 0.79, are relatively stable until a cataclysmic event like the plague triggers a radical redistribution of wealth. And so over the last few decades, apparently Gini coefficients have been coming down in like Latin American countries. And he says that from every standpoint, such reforms are clearly the right thing to do. But throughout the great sweep of human history, egalitarian societies with low Gini coefficients rarely dominate world events. From the Han Dynasty of ancient China to the Roman Empire to the United States, there seems to be a sweet spot of economic injustice that is moderately unfair to most of its citizens, but produces extremely powerful societies. So there's this very interesting balance where obviously pure communist egalitarianism is not desirable because those societies collapse, and massive inequality isn't desirable either because then there's no motivation to work. So there is a ideal amount of inequality, and maybe it is this 0.42 number that the United States happens to be at. Maybe it's a little bit lower, a little higher. It's really hard to say, but it shows why it's insufficient to argue for, total equality or total pure capitalism, right? Like there's some level of appropriate inequality that is actually maybe in a sense truly the most equal, or like the 0 to 1 makes it feel like you need to be at 0, right, to have true equality. But if those societies don't last or they can't grow, then maybe the best society is one with this appropriate amount of income inequality. But one of the defining characteristics of humans that allows us to figure these things out is our ability to think, our ability to experiment with different government styles and figure out what works best. So, like I said, really enjoyed the book. Freedom by Sebastian Junger. The story of him traversing the railroad tracks is fantastic too. I didn't get to touch on it too much, but it's also quick. It's a little over 100 pages, so you'll get through it relatively quickly. If you enjoyed this, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, send it to a friend, like and subscribe on YouTube, all those normal things. I've been really enjoying doing this show. Like I say, every week it's been a great excuse to read some of these books that I've wanted to read, share my thoughts on them with you, and it's been fun hearing all of your feedback. So I'm going to keep doing it. I'll be back next week, and thank you for listening.